As the longest-serving executive director in the history of the organization most hated by American conservatives, the American Civil Liberties Union. Tonight on the Atheist Forum, we will meet and talk to Howard Simon. You are about to enter the no superstition zone of rational thinking and intellectual curiosity here on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340. That's right. It's the voice of atheism in Florida. Our website, talk.aof.ngo, and your chance to insult an atheist for only $2. We'll give you Howard for half price tonight, $1. But before we get to Howard, we want to follow up on our weekly appraisal of how Melania Trump is coming along with her campaign to eliminate cyberbullying. Joe?
Well, Howard, I hope you're ready, because the answer to your question, Ed, is, so far as I can ascertain, nothing whatsoever.
Okay. Progress as usual. Okay, Joe Reinhardt, along with Tracy Thomas, Jim Peterson, and me, Ed Golly, in the Tan Talk Radio Network studio, talking with Howard Simon. Howard, thank you for joining us tonight.
Nice to be with you, folks.
First question. Something I've never been able to quite get my mind around, Howard, is why there's so much opposition in this country to an organization that works so steadfastly to protect American civil liberties, which seems to be the stalwart of our whole Constitution and our whole way of life. What do you make of it?
Well, that is a really good question, and I don't know, maybe your listeners can figure that out. I always thought over the years that, there are probably many reasons, but certainly one reason is the confusion between the lawyers and the clients. And some of the people we have represented are some of the most hated people, maybe I have to say, perhaps rightly so. But their case involves a fundamental issue of principle involving constitutional rights. The government hardly comes after moderate Republicans or the League of Women Voters. They come after groups on the extremes. So we have represented groups from the far left, on even the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, groups on the far right, white nationalist groups, the Klan, the American Nazi Party, groups who, people may have a hard time understanding this and have a hard time understanding how the American legal system operates, but we all benefit when the courts figure out a way to enact a legal principle that defends the right of extreme groups. Everybody benefits by that. So I think one reason is that people often associate us with the people we represent, and I think another reason is, frankly, a lot of what we do is challenge the majority view. I mean, when we go to court and we challenge what a legislature has enacted or what a governor has ordered or the president or Congress, what we're doing is using the anti-majoritarian institutions of government. That's what the federal courts are. Sure. The federal courts basically say that a law is not valid if it interferes with and violates the rights of even a single person. So we are almost always, in standing up for the Bill of Rights, we're almost always assaulting majority opinion. What used to be called in this country and appreciated the tyranny of the majority.
You've been the executive director for over 40 years, I believe, the ACLU. Is that right?
23
Sorry.
in the state of Michigan and 21 here in
Okay.
Florida, so that adds up to 44. That's correct.
Right. I'm not sure how to ask this question, whether in that period of time, what you think the most significant challenge to civil liberties in this country has been, or what you think it is today. So I'll let you answer the question of your choice.
Wow, that's almost an unfair question. There have been so many battles. I know some of the main battles that I've been involved in over more than 4 decades that have made me feel proud and good. I certainly think that the last chapter hasn't been written yet, but I want to say that the work protecting fundamental constitutional values like privacy and separation of church and state from assault by the current Constitution Revision Commission that is still sitting and maybe wraps up some of their work very soon, has a crucial meeting tomorrow. That, I think, was very good. But I do want to say, I think it's clear that I don't think there's ever been such a challenge, not only in policies, but to our democratic institutions, the role of the courts, the role of the press, that has been launched by this current Trump administration. I mean, it's why, for example, our membership has soared by more than 1 million members since the November election, because there are people looking to us to save democracy in America. I mean, the comprehensive assaults on democratic institutions, principally, the courts and the press, the attack on fake news, the attack on the established press which people rely on to get to know. I mean, democracy depends upon an independent press. Democracy in America depends on the courts. And so this Trump administration is just, I think, just an overwhelming threat to democratic institutions. And I don't know how this is going to end. I don't know how we come out from this, but this is the most serious problem.
Wow.
Howard, how much of this attack on the press and on the courts do you think is just the consequence of a Twitter fiend who sits on the toilet and may suffer from constipation of the brain, as opposed to really a concerted effort by the alt-right or the alt-left or the alt-anybody to actually fundamentally undermine our most required foundations of democracy? Do you think it's more accident than stupidity, or do you think it's more malice?
I think it's more serious than that. Mm-hmm. I think I think it's not just simply the psychological quirks of the current president, but the effect of undermining confidence in independent. I mean, what he hates most is anybody that will criticize him, exactly. and the independent press that report actual facts end up criticizing him, and the effort to undermine public confidence. Don't believe what you read in the failing Washington Post or the failing New York Times. Believe what the facts that you get from me or Breitbart. That is a much more fundamental threat than simply the psychological quirks of the guy that wakes up at 5 a.m. and starts tweeting.
441-3000, if you care to join the conversation, we'll pick up the phone and you can talk to Howard Simon, Executive Director of the ACLU of Florida, here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Jim?
Well, Howard, would it be fair to say that the chief client of the ACLU is, in fact, the U.S. Constitution? It seems that the main tool of your work is the courts and education because ultimately the prospects for a democratic life in these United States depends upon the people, and the people have to understand what their Constitution means and how important it is to defend it. What is your sense, apart from the fact that the membership has increased by such a tremendous amount over the course of the last year, but what do you see in the public forum that suggests that there's a greater awareness of this?
Oh, my God! Well, let me say a little bit about the question, and I'll go into the how you ended up. I do want to say that's a traditional way of looking at the work of our organization, which is 2 years to be 100 years old. So there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of retrospective analysis, and it is the case that for many years we characterize ourselves as saying that our only client is the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, but I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, we have had. Maybe that's true when the legal program of the ACLU has primarily been filing friend of the court briefs with the United States Supreme Court. But, there was a period in the last couple of decades where we ended up primarily, while we still do a lot of that, we also represent actual people. People whose cases depend upon the enforcement of constitutional protections. I'm thinking of the right of the LGBT citizens in Florida to a right to equality, equal treatment, or the right of anybody to have freedom of speech, or former felons to earn their way back into the community. So, you could look at the ACLU and say, "Oh, their only client is the Bill of Rights," but many times we represent real people whose case involves a fundamental principle of the Bill of Rights. But the second part of now I forgot what it was, rattling on, so where you ended up. I forgot where you ended up.
Well, I was asking as to what overall is your perception of the growth of an appreciation of freedom that
yes, how people have responded, right, and whether there's been any impact. And you look at how there are so many indicators of the fact that the public is responding, I think, dramatically to the results of the November election. The Women's March that occurred the day after, the surge in participation in some of the elections that have occurred since November of 2016, the election in Alabama and Virginia, elsewhere, even the election for a state house vacancy in Sarasota. Those are the massive turnout in airports around the country of people protesting Trump's inept effort to impose a Muslim travel ban.
Howard?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and the recent demonstrations that have occurred all over the country trying to secure some kind of rational gun safety measures and so on. I think the people are responding in a way that I don't recall for many decades.
Howard, isn't it also the case that if you approach people at random on the street and read them various of the
Constitution, Bill of Rights,
various of the Bill of Rights, many of them will either disagree that it's in the Constitution or think that it ought to be illegal, or that none of these things ought to be legal?
Yes, I have heard that, and I have seen polls to that effect, and that's a little frightening that people think that things like in the First Amendment or things in the Bill of Rights are kind of dangerous and revolutionary. But the fact of the matter is, they are dangerous and revolutionary. They're principles that were used as a basis for revolution against England in the 18th century. They were revolutionary principles, and
they're a threat to the right people.
but the declining support for, the declining support for freedom of speech, where people think that, oh, I believe in freedom of speech, but not for that. That's too hateful, or hate speech is not protected by the Constitution. That's a little dangerous. Our fundamental rights are kind of precarious, where people don't even know what they are and don't appreciate them when they do learn what they are.
Howard, this country, as you and I both know, was founded as a great secular experiment. But I often hear so often from people that this country was founded on Christian principles. I know what I say when I hear that. But I would love to hear, because I'm sure you hear the same thing, Howard. I'd love to hear what you say when you hear that.
Well, it's, it's mythologizing. It's people... I hear that from people, let's cut to the chase. I hear that from people who want to think of and want to ensure and want to nail down America as a theocracy. And that's why these issues of separation of church and state are endless. We are dealing with a well-organized movement in this country that has always been present, that just want to make sure that America is a theocracy, but not merely a theocracy, a Christian theocracy. So in order to construct that mythology, they have to cherry pick. They can find things that George Washington said, or this person said, or this person. But at the end of the day, I'd like to hear what they say when the fact that the word God doesn't appear in the Constitution. And where religion does appear in the Constitution, it appears in, as a guarantee that there shall be no religious test for public office. I agree with you. I know where Jefferson's sympathies were and Madison's sympathies were, and I know that this was designed to be a country in which religion was supposed to flourish, but without government sponsorship.
Yeah.
But that's now how our opponents see this, or want to see this, or want to rewrite history to make sure that they see this as a theocracy.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you can argue about what they said, but we know what they did. And what they did...
Right. Good point. Nicely put.
If you read the U.S. Constitution, including all 27 of its amendments, there are 7,591 words. Not one of them is God, Jesus, Bible, Christ, or commandments. I think that's the end of the argument.
Well, I would like to hear how they, because then they go point to things like the Declaration of Independence, exactly, or the writings of other people and so on. But at the end of the day, we're governed by the Constitution, and I'd like to hear the response to that. That's, the Declaration of Independence is a manifesto about how we're no longer going to accept rule by Britain.
It's a letter.
When we were organized as a government, the government is run by the Constitution, not by the Declaration of Independence.
Well, I think there were some Christian principles that were incorporated in daily life when this country was founded, which included genocide against the native people, slavery, oppression of women, and so on. But because we have the Constitution, we've been able to wean ourselves away from these horrid Christian principles and seek civil liberties for all people. I once was attending a lecture where a fellow said that the first case brought before the Supreme Court that dealt with an individual's civil liberties was in about 1935 or 1937, something to that effect.
Yeah, it was. Yes, in the for most of our life in this country, the basic rights we had were rights on paper, and it was a slow process, starting in the 1920s and then the 30s. But then, you have to think about the court of the period of Earl Warren, from maybe from the Brown versus Board of Education decision to the late 1960s. There was only a small window in American history when the rights that we have on paper were actually used to be enforced against state and local governments.
And all of those decisions, like Brown and Roe v. Wade and the prayer decision, they all came down 9-zip or 8-1. I mean, there was none of this 5-4 crap like we see today. There was a consensus, and there was very little dissent to the fact that people were entitled to a basic set of universal rights.
Mm-hmm.
Which sort of
well, we live in very dangerous, hyper-partisan times.
I can remember the impeach Earl Warren billboards along the highway.
Oh, I remember those.
It's probably true that the motivation for the civil rights movement existed in the period directly after the Second World War, when perception was heightened about the nature of our freedom. One of Roosevelt's most famous speeches is the Four Freedoms speech, and it seems to me that we've gotten away from that, and we've gotten into identity politics and so forth, and so people's loyalties are now somewhat more diffuse than they used to be, and the appreciation of what it means to be an American, an understanding of the American experience and democracy and our own history, it seems to me, is grossly lacking in many areas. Now, of course, my perception could be wrong. How do you think? Do you think that there's an increase in the number of people who understand where we came from and who we are, or is it the case that we're gradually drifting away from that?
Well, I want to say I'm not sure how to answer your question, but I do want to say this, that and I want to say this in a way to congratulate you folks, you plural, the work you do and the work a lot of organizations do and a lot of people on the ground, the kind of principles that we all try to defend. I'm not sure they ever have secured majority support. It has always been a determined minority of people like you, people like me, and others that have had to fight hard for to defend the basic principles that protect freedom in America. Maybe it's the case, I'm not really sure, but maybe it's the case that that finally principles of moral and ethical principles of equality and equal treatment, maybe it reached the majority support during the civil rights movement. I'm not really sure about that, but it was a determined minority and the activism of a determined minority that has always, I think, protected fundamental principles and brought about changes in policies.
Well, we're talking with Howard Simon, the Executive Director of ACLU Florida, here on the Atheist Forum. And if you have questions, comments, or insults for Howard or Mr. Simon, you could say 727-441-3000. Get you onto the program. I want to talk a little bit about the a potential national Constitution convention, but we want to take a little short break and tell our listeners about our organization, Atheists of Florida, before we get into that. And I also want to ask you about the Scooter Libby pardon. So if you'll be ready to deal with some of those issues, Howard, we'll take a quick break, come back with a quote, and then continue our conversation here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. We've now been around 25 years, and we're still going strong. Joe Reinhardt, you have a quote for us.
I do, and it's from a gentleman by the name of Samuel Clemens. Some of you may know him as Mark Twain. It says, "The more I learn about people, the more I like my dog."
Well, before we go to the National Constitution Convention, which is not anything that is an immediate threat to us, let's talk about what is going on here in Florida with the Constitution Revision Committee. And I know that's an issue that really gets the fur up on your back, Howard. I know that I think what intrigues me most is how many of the issues that they want to put on the ballot are multiple issues and almost seem completely unrelated. And I don't understand how those can even get on the ballot, because isn't there a law that historically is upheld by our state Supreme Court that says that any of these amendment issues must be single issue amendments that the voters can vote on?
Well, that would be, there different institutions have different standards. That would be true if you and I were proposing a constitutional amendment, or it would even be true if the legislature were proposing a constitutional amendment. But it really is not true if for amendments that are being put directly on the ballot by the Constitution Revision Commission. I think it may be challengeable. Some of their actions may be challengeable to the Florida Supreme Court, but the basis for the challenge would only be that if it were deceptive, if the title of the proposed constitutional amendment did not reflect what was actually in the amendment. So there are different standards. So they might be able to get away with bundling things that are completely unrelated, although that's what tomorrow is about. They are going to spend all day tomorrow arguing about whether or not things should be unbundled or whether they'll be put on the ballot, even things that are completely unrelated and put on the ballot in order to essentially con the voters who may like one thing that's bundled but not two others, and they will have to end up voting for it or whatnot. Or, frankly, I think that the more that they bundle things that are not related, the more it ensures that everything they propose will be defeated. I don't think that the people of Florida will tolerate trying to be conned and bullied, by having to have something pushed down their throats because they have to vote for something that they like one thing, but they don't like the other. So, I don't know. This whole Constitution Revision Commission this year has been a very, very interesting story. I do want to say that I mentioned this before. I'm pleased that I'm thrilled that I thought the things that were the most serious threats to our rights have been defeated. But the remaining big issues, I think, is a continuing effort to dismantle public education, secular public education in Florida, and replace it essentially by privatized education through private schools, privately run public schools, charter schools, and those are the most serious proposals, I think, that may be headed to the ballot. But we'll know that tomorrow.
Howard, do you know how this crazy CRC process got started? It seems that, like, our state has something that is very peculiar, because it seems to result in a lot of what would ordinarily be statutory laws embedded in our Constitution, which should, I would think, specify how the government is to be run and just let it go at that, like our U.S. Constitution.
Oh, I completely agree with you. We don't, I came from Michigan. Michigan, like many states in the upper Midwest, have a tradition from, I think, the 1890s called initiative and referendum, where the citizens can propose laws or actually have a referendum to repeal a law. But the only way in Florida to go over the head of our legislature is to put things in the Constitution. So there are all sorts of things that are in our Constitution that do not belong in it, that in any sane system, I agree with you, are just policies that which can be easily amended over the years by a legislature. But we do not have that process here. But we have a process in which, while many states, of course, many states can revise their constitutions from time to time, in Florida it is mandatory in our Constitution that every 20 years the governor and the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court appoint 37 members to a commission that have the frightening power to put proposed amendments to the Constitution directly on the ballot. And so that's what makes this process this year so dangerous is that 20 years ago, the last time we had a Constitution Revision Commission, we had divided government. I think we had a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, and divided government forces people with different points of view to sit around the table and make compromises. We do not live in that world anymore, and what we have are people who were put on the Constitution Revision Commission because they have a particular agenda to do away with public education or to do away with abortion rights or do away with separation of church and state. So this is a very dangerous group of people, and so I'm hoping that we will further dilute what they do, and if not, the people will reject what they propose come November.
And if we could just back up to the issue of school vouchers, we've contemplated on this program in the past the reason that there's such a concentrated effort to dismantle the public school system. We think it's maybe one or both of these issues. It's either to transfer enormous sums of tax dollars to private corporations that may then contribute to right-wing candidates, or it's to re-implement segregation in the school system, which that cannot be done in the public school system.
Plus, it destroys one of the few remaining unions of any strength.
Yes.
I'm amazed at you. I'm amazed at you guys. You left out one of the major reasons. First of all, I think all three answers all three analysis that you came up with, I completely agree with. But you left out something I think that there is a segment, going back to what we first started talking about, there is a segment that hates the public schools because the public schools are secular institutions in America, or supposed to be secular institutions. Right. And they don't transmit, for example, just as an example, they do not transmit moral values, which we do need to transmit to the next generation, but they don't transmit moral values through religious values. And I think I think the public schools of America are hated institutions because they are determined to be secular institutions.
So thank goodness we finally have a president in this country that can spearhead that effort by being the cheerleader for all of these things, right? Yeah. The cheerleader for American morality. Oh, my gosh. All right.
He's going through some stormy times.
Yeah.
Well, you have to admire his self-control to stop pursuing adulterous affairs long enough to screw up the economy and the government.
Nobody can say we aren't right.
When the Constitution of our country was signed, Article 5 allowed that the Constitution could be amended if 2/3 of the state legislatures called for a convention. Since that time, 33 amendments have been proposed, 27 subsequently ratified, which is a process which requires approval in 3/4 of the states. In recent years, the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force has been campaigning with great success for an Article 5 convention. There are now 27 states in which the legislatures have passed resolutions calling for a convention that would propose a balanced budget amendment. The 2/3 of the states threshold for calling a convention is 34, and as it happens, there are 7 states which have not yet called for a convention to propose a balanced budget amendment, but in which Republicans control both houses of the legislature. Howard, I know that's an issue that also gets your attention because of what could potentially happen if an Article 5 constitutional convention was ever convened? And can you go into that a little bit for us and tell us what the potential consequences of something like that could be, given how close we are to potentially doing
right.
it? As soon as next year, as I understand it.
Well, I can answer that in one word: catastrophic. I mean, of all the amendments that have been added to our Constitution, none have been added by a Constitution Convention. We've never had a Constitution Convention in this country, although I take it back, and we did have it one time, and that illustrates the dangers, because you recall that a convention was called simply to revise the Articles of Confederation, and then they met and they decided, I think under Alexander Hamilton's major prompting, that this thing was so riddled with problems that even though the call to the convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, let's just junk the whole Articles of Confederation and start all over again and redesign the government through a U.S. Constitution. Now, thank God we had some really brilliant people there at that time. But now, fast forward to 2018 or 2020, if we had a Constitution Convention in this country, do you think that the First Amendment would survive?
I think it'd be the first thing to go. I think the first thing they'd do is say we're going to get rid of that prohibition against establishing religion.
Oh, my God. And even on our president says he wonders, gee, what? He's very disappointed of why we can't use the legal system to sue more critics for libel. I mean, that's
in the UK, and you can.
So, this would be a disaster. It would be catastrophic. We'd have a Constitution Convention called for the purposes of writing a balanced budget amendment, but once they're seated, they would have the power to do anything they want to do, just like the Articles of Confederation Constitution Convention.
Now, those 27 states that have approved this don't lose that status of approval unless their state legislatures actually go in and reverse that decision. Is that correct?
I think that is true, because that's, I'm thinking of the model of the Equal Rights Amendment, and I think that, so I think what you're saying is true, that unless there's a rescission, then I think that the call is still good. But who knows? Look, like lots of other things in America, this will be up to what 5 people in Washington, D.C., sitting in the U.S. Supreme Court may ultimately have to say.
That's just where I was going next. The Supreme Court appointees and the federal judges, of course, that are appointed by the current president and or his successor, if anything should happen to him, which would probably both be appointing the same types of judges who would be really interpreting the Constitution to sway the country more toward a theocracy than a secular nation. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Boy, this is, presidents come and go, but Supreme Court
sometimes
justices...
Sometimes not fast enough. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. But you're right, not Supreme Court justices.
No, they hang around for several decades, and they have, if you think back to some of the fundamental rights that we have in terms of citizen police relations, religion in the public schools, separation of church and state, the right of privacy, the right to equal access to education for racial minorities in this country. Those came from the court, and more so than from Congress. Yes, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but so many of the issues that were maybe too contentious or too controversial for politicians who have to stand for election or re-election came from the court, not from. So our how we live our lives in this country has come so much from the courts, and as I said earlier, this is what presidential elections, I think, are all about. Presidents come and go. I mean, the first George Bush presidency lasted 4 years. Clarence Thomas is still sitting there on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. The best qualified. Who the hell did he think he was kidding? He was the only black guy they could find in the world that was a conservative. And he said this with a straight face, like we believed him. He's the best qualified. He had like 3 years experience on the bench, wasn't it? Something like that? I understand the ACLU has filed already 130 lawsuits against actions taken by Trump, who's only been in office, less than a year and a half. And I know that the ACLU does not just drop these lawsuits willy-nilly on anybody, because the attorneys, as I understand it, operate or should I say provide their services pro bono.
Yes, we still depend upon a lot on pro bono, and we have a lot of attorneys on staff. We have 7 lawyers on staff here in Florida. And I would say I lost track of how many we have on our national staff and all of the state affiliates around the country. But there are hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. We're the largest, law firm in the country. But look, I would say maybe half of those lawsuits. Yes, it's true. We have filed about 130 different lawsuits on everything from voting restrictions. You remember the Chris Kobach commission, to the ban on transgender people in the military, ban on EEOC interpretations of protections against discrimination for LGBT members, and so on and so on. Half of those lawsuits, though, about half, probably are for digging out information that the Trump administration has been hiding. So we have to get access to information, and most often sue to get the information to know what's going on, to then form that into a lawsuit.
Let's talk about the Scooter Libby part, and since that just happened within the last few days, the consensus being that this is a message that Trump is sending out to people like, say his attorney Cohen, that you don't need to worry about getting in trouble because I'm going to pardon you. And so without that prospect of a pardon, it seems to me that Cohen's in a precarious position for a couple of reasons. Because if he lied on behalf of the president, he can be in trouble. If he engaged in a contract with Stormy Daniels on behalf of a client who was unaware that he was doing it, in spite of the fact that he left a line for him to sign on the contract, he can be disbarred. But then, of course, Trump can simply come back in and say, I pardon everything, and have the bar reinstate you. Is that the sense that you get of the reason behind the Libby pardon, and as well as the Joe Arpaio pardon, the sheriff of Arizona. Phoenix, wasn't it? Maricopa County, whatever.
Maricopa County around Phoenix, yes.
And the issue of attorney-client privilege. I hear that being bandied around, but what we learn from watching the news shows is if the attorney is involved in criminal conduct with his client, he can forfeit that privilege in order to accommodate an investigation of potential criminal activity. Isn't that correct?
Well, yes, but I got several reactions to what you said. First of all, I completely agree with you. I think it sends a signal that to the people who are loyal to him that, don't worry, I'll take care of you. But to drill down a little bit, what it is that he's going to take care of them about is that what was Scooter Libby convicted of? He convicted of lying to the FBI. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the conversation we were having a little while ago about his demonizing of the press and of other institutions. And this is part of his demonization of the FBI. and that they're a bad institution, and if you lie to them, it's not so bad. I mean, what it indicates is that I think the president is. For him, the most important value is loyalty to him personally, and not necessarily being a good citizen or following or being a law-abiding citizen. The other comment I want to make is that I think we should hold our breath for a little while. I think the whole country is holding its breath to see what it is that the Mueller special prosecution team is going to find, having raided Trump's lawyer's home, hotel room, and his homes. The files that they will uncover, and how much criminality involvement and maybe even collusion with some of the, if not Russians, Ukrainians, or whatnot. I think there's probably a lot that they will discover that will affect this conversation and conversations like this around the country.
Well, Howard, you in this regard of what we've been discussing today, and all the problems, and they are enormous problems that we are encountering thanks to the present administration and with what is going along with it and before it. But our liberties are built upon a long accumulated tradition of ever-increasing freedom. And will the people, all of us, in your experience, will they so easily give up on this tradition? Can we expect that? And this is kind of central because our liberty depends on us, basically, us as individual citizens. And there are those who think that people are not sufficiently aware of our problems, that they won't stand up for their own liberty. But do you think this is true?
Well, we'll see in November. I mean, we can sit around and talk as much as we want, but people have got to get out and vote. Voting is the cure for the scandalous situation in this country, in which maybe only half the people who are eligible to vote. That has got to be corrected. So I want to come back and have this discussion with you after November. I want to see what the turnout is and what the impact of that is, and see whether or not revolutions occur in America. The way in which revolutions occur in this country are, in some ways, at the ballot box. And we'll see whether or not what happened in Virginia and New Jersey and Alabama are symptoms of how the people may be wanting to send a message to the national administration that they've lived under for the last year and a half.
And of course, most important, who Mr. Putin is pulling for, Joe.
And Howard, to that last comment, we can all only say, hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Right. Joe, you had something?
No, go ahead.
Oh.
Howard, do you think, we keep hearing about the Democratic wave that is coming, and we're certainly, many of us, hoping for that, hoping for a divided government on the national stage. But do you personally see that filtering down to the state of Florida or other states that are very red at the moment?
Well, I want to answer your question, but I want to make it clear. I mean, we're not the legal arm of the Democratic Party. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we can get into this too, nor are we an atheist organization. I mean, I love you folks and I applaud what you do, but we're a religious liberty organization as opposed to an atheist organization. So, but I read the newspapers like you do, and I can see, and I can see the results that happened around the country and in small elections that fill vacancies, or off-year elections for governor of New Jersey I forgot where was the other one. Virginia, New Jersey, Virginia, and then that very strange Senate election in Alabama, where almost an acknowledged pedophile got 600,000 votes. I mean, just somewhat astounding. But anyway, so I don't know. It seems like there is a big response by the people who want to send a negative message about the national administration. But we'll see in November. Oh, but your question was, will it filter down to Florida? And your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea. I do have to say, there are some barriers to, even if there is what's called a blue wave, even if there is a blue wave, and even if it affects Florida, there are built-in barriers against the effects of a blue wave in Florida, and that is what I have called very effective, competent gerrymandering in our Florida legislature. So even if there were a blue wave, it might impact the Florida Senate, but I think the Florida House has made itself pretty much immune from the effects of the people's wrath.
Hopefully the folks in Pennsylvania will be setting the stage for us in Florida to get closer to the one man, one vote goal that the Supreme Court has said that we all ought to achieve or have available to us. Right.
Well, we did have major success. You remember in 2010, which was a Tea Party wave, that notwithstanding the Tea Party wave, we were able to, and we were part of the coalition that played a significant role in this. We added the Fair Districts amendments to the Florida Constitution to ban partisan gerrymandering in our state constitution. But the effect of that will take, it may be more than one census, so we may not see the full impact of the ban on partisan gerrymandering in Florida until after the 2020 census. We did see some of it. I mean, there were 3 congressional districts that had to be redrawn, and Florida Senate districts had to be redrawn, but the full effect maybe will take more than one census.
Well, of course, Atheists of Florida is also not a political organization. We don't take a position with respect to candidates, political candidates, or endorse them. All atheism is a rejection of the supernatural. So we don't necessarily agree on a lot of the social issues, but we do see that the right wing tends to want to impose its religious ideology on us, and as atheists we tend to think that the Constitution is the document that protects us from that imposition. We have a little less than a minute left. Are there any final words you'd like to say to our audience, Howard?
No, I appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to emphasize again that our freedoms depend upon an educated, activist group of people that could affect broader public opinion. So I congratulate you for this show and all the work that you've done over the years.
Have you read Fire and Fury?
Thank you for your time.
Yes. Have you read Fire and Fury?
No, not yet.
You going to read Comey's book? We'd love to get your opinion. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Howard.
Okay.
And
thanks for the 44 years.
Along with the staff, I hope you'll join us again next week. And remember, if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it. You have been listening to the
Just because somebody wrote it down?
Learn more about Atheists of Florida.
Make them prove
Visit
it.
our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. Join us again next Sunday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.